Good morning, Dr. Cindy.
Good morning, Dennis.
So nice to visit with you again. It's been about a month and a half since we last visited, and we talked about families and holidays and blended families, and that was a great conversation. I got some great feedback on it. I know that our conversations always aren't, I guess, what people would deem as super positive, but here's how I look at them. And it kind of goes into what with you do and things that I've done in my past when I'm getting therapy is that if you have issues, if you have problems, if you have anything that's bugging your life, talk about it. Talk about it with
Absolutely.
anybody, somebody, just to get it off your chest and not internalize. Because I've done a lot of that over my life too. And it's easy to get depressed and angry and loneliness and isolated. And that's what I know you want to talk about today is about loneliness and isolation.
That's
And
right.
there are so many ways that we can go about that. And I realize that every time we talk about a subject matter, there are many different tentacles that it can go to, but also there's also many different interpretations. But as a human being, and also as a doctor, when you talk to families, single people, anybody that you happen to chat with in your practice, when it comes to loneliness and feeling alone, tell me what that means to you and what people are feeling in general.
I hear people describing feeling both disconnected from themselves as well as feeling disconnected from other people. So there's something about being in contact with others that helps us remain connected to ourselves. And when we don't have contact with others and we're just left to ourselves in a total vacuum, that doesn't lend itself to comfort or a feeling of groundedness. That when you're alone in your own head with your own thoughts for too long, it doesn't bode well for a sense of calm, a sense of confidence. Those kinds of things are what come to my mind first.
So you and I have been on this planet for a while, and I think we can both agree that when it comes to loneliness and isolation, that doesn't discriminate on any age. When you're young, middle age, or older, you can experience it, can't you?
Absolutely. And there are different seasons of loneliness. They show up different ways at different times in your life, I would say. And there's sometimes different parts of your life that can lend themselves to being more lonely by virtue of the stage of life you're in. So there's some times in life that are harder periods when it comes to loneliness than others.
When you talk to people, is there a common thread to loneliness and isolation? And the reason why I ask that is because I've been with my wife for a very long time, but maybe when we have a heated debate or maybe an argument, I'll feel a sense of isolation and loneliness that either I did something wrong or we didn't agree, and the person I love, I don't feel connected with right. So I guess my point is that when you're with somebody, you can still feel alone and some isolation. But is there a common thread with people when they feel these kind of feelings?
I think there's not one common thread. I think there's several things that we would use to describe loneliness. So that's one sort of loneliness, the sort of loneliness where you actually have a partner in life and somehow you're not connecting, you're not resonating with each other. And that's a specific kind of quite painful loneliness that can happen in partnership. And I would say happens in all partnerships. Um, then there's the kind of loneliness that is truly being alone. People who don't have a partner and are alone, and to be in the company of another requires effort on a regular basis. When you have a partner, you have a ready companion right there all the time. So, literally, the part about being literally isolated in the world and that to be in the company of another requires work. That's a different sort of experience of loneliness. Everybody actually is alone. Some people have the good fortune to have a partner, other people are alone. I don't want to preference being with a partner over being alone. People can be
Right.
happy being alone, but people
Absolutely.
who are alone and aren't partnered do still need to feel some sense of community, usually. Not many people are just comfortable being in total isolation.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up because, as you point out, everybody's different. And I have friends and I have family members that are alone by choice and seem to be quite happy about that, that they don't necessarily have a permanent partner in their life. And with that said, is there something to be said for that? They're just, people are different, and some people dig being alone and they don't feel that isolation and loneliness because they choose to go that direction?
I wouldn't make it such a linear equation. I would say that um, people could choose to be alone or might prefer to not have a partner, but that doesn't necessarily speak directly to the feeling of loneliness.
Okay. How so?
So that's one issue, the issue of choosing to be alone. So some people choose to be alone and yet they feel very connected in the world. Other people choose to be alone and it maybe doesn't even feel like a choice and it's not a happy choice. So whether it's due to divorce or death, that somehow or other they find themselves alone, or maybe they never partnered and maybe they really wish they had. So I think how people come to this and how they view their aloneness really matters. I think some people really fight with the notion that we all are alone. Truth is, we all are alone, even though we're in the company of others. No one entirely knows you or perfectly connects with you. And if you're
Yeah.
fortunate enough to have someone that you connect with quite a lot, that's a real gift.
Yeah, I agree with that. I want to talk to you about young people. You and I both have children. I have a 21-year-old daughter, and the irony of her life living as a Gen Z person with all the social media, all the tech, and all the things that she has around her, I've sensed over her teenage years up until now, her last year in college, that there are bouts with loneliness and isolation, mainly because of friend groups or lack of friend groups at times. And I realize that everybody who's grown up in the history of man and women and people in general on this earth, there's a sense of loneliness at some time of your life. But it seems like there's a lot of irony when it comes to young people with all that's around them, that there's that sense of loneliness and isolation that she's told me about at times, especially when it comes specifically to friend groups not being invited to stuff or feeling included. And even though you have a bunch of people around you, still having those very difficult feelings as a young person trying to find your way in the world.
Yes, I think that's true. It is kind of an ironic thing that you have all this access to what you would think would help you feel more included. But in fact, those very same devices or technology connections are what make people feel more isolated. Like you've probably heard of fear of missing out. So some
Yes.
people describe one site, one social media site, Facebook, as a place that often is described that it lends itself to feeling a fear of missing out. Like, oh, I see in your pictures that you have this wonderful life, and I don't have pictures like that to put up on my site, that kind of thing. And so there's also a real misnomer about, I think a very common thing is that people do a lot of presuming that what they experience on the inside is comparable to what they're seeing on the outside, and that's not
Yeah.
true. So people can present really well. Their social media site can look great, or whatever social media thing you're involved in. But that doesn't mean that they're happy and that they're feeling connected and that life is as good as it looks in the picture. And some people use those markers as one of the ways to kind of validate their feeling of loneliness. See, look on their site, they've got all this stuff going on. I don't have all that stuff going on. But truth be told, probably everyone could come up with something to put on there that makes it look good, but that's not the same as what it really means to feel deeply connected in real time.
Boy, there's a lot of topics that you brought up. I know we've talked about social media with young people before and things going on behind the scenes with families that we're not aware of when everybody's life looks beautiful. I want to put a pin in that for another time, but I do want to mention that life doubles down on Gen Z because they're finding out in real time when they're not invited to stuff.
Oh
And,
yeah, no,
and
that's a very that yeah,
yeah, that one is just that's pinning you to the mat in life. That's brutal.
it's pretty painful to understand that you see in the pictures, oh, there was an event. Oh, there was a bunch of people at the event, and clearly I'm not one of the people in the picture.
Right. I've also explained to my daughter too, and I'm sure you've had this conversation in your family, that when you see a family maybe doing something glamorous or wonderful, or everybody's happy, and my daughter feeling, left out or isolated, or why don't we do those kind of things? They have such a wonderful, glamorous life. I try to explain to her at a younger age that that really might not be the case. And that people put on a front to, that everything is always good, because why would you put on anything negative on social media unless it's maybe a loved one passing or something that is relevant for people to give you some love back if you're going through a tough time. And you can see my point. And then she finds out years down the road that that family, for whatever reason, wasn't so glamorous behind the scenes, and that everybody, social classes, isolation, loneliness, and bad stuff doesn't discriminate, once again, to anybody. And I try to explain that to her even to this day, that when you see social media, it's just not as it appears to be. And maybe we can go with that thread a little bit too, because, we are talking about social media and young people. When it comes to maybe older people that are in their 20s or 30s, maybe they're newly married, or maybe they've been together for 5 or 10 years, in those situations, and they're still finding their way as a couple, and also being on social media. What kind of, what I'm trying to ask you is, what kind of sense of loneliness and isolation do people in their 20s and their 30s are feeling? Because once again, it's a different kind of life for them, whether they're with somebody or not. But when you talk to people, what are they feeling? What's going on with them when it comes to isolation and loneliness?
So if we're talking about the 20s and the 30s, that's the years that you're deciding, do you want to have a partner? And if you do, what do you want? Do you want a long-term permanent relationship? And do you want children and all those kinds of things? Where do you want to live? All the pieces, the independent functioning as well as the couple connection. And so then there's some of those issues, like, how do I find my community? Because one of the things is, when if you do go on to college, then you have an extension of what happened in high school with having a community around you all the time. You go into the cafeteria and you see all your buddies like you did in high school. Or if you didn't go on to college, then that ready-made community isn't there anymore. And now you're out in the world. And how do you find your people? How do you make your friends? What are the ways that you maintain and continue moving forward with making more connections? That in itself can be a really hard thing. So like, if you get a job in a certain city, the one that's coming to my mind is New York. You're living in New York, that's one of the loneliest, most populated areas in the country. People describe that as an incredibly lonely place to be as a single person, and yet everybody's shoulder to shoulder there. So it's
Yeah.
kind of an interesting twist. Like, a lot of young people go there in their 20s, and yet they can't find community. So building community is something that's happening in the 20s and 30s. And which kind of community are you building? Are you building it alone as a single person? Are you in search of a partner? All these things take up mental space and can contribute to isolation. If you're on a quest to find a partner, then that's taking up your energy, and you may not feel like you have a lot of other connections. It also makes you vulnerable in the dating world to not have a lot of other connections.
I want to bring up one thing that you had mentioned there, and that was a huge dissertation about living in a big city and the
Yes.
irony of being lonely. It's just, and my daughter lived up there for 4 or 5 months. Luckily, she found her community, and I did want to talk to you about communities, because once again, when you're trying to find your community, your tribe, your people, whatever you want to call it, it's hard to do at times. And this goes back to the whole friend thing. And it's not necessarily for just young people, because my wife and I, who are in our 50s, have found it hard, especially all the moving we've done, to make really good friends to hang out with, that we enjoy their company. It's just hard. So when it comes to making that community, finding your tribe, it seems like that can be very frustrating, and also quickly bring on isolation and loneliness. That I'm trying hard to find a friend group and I cannot do it. I know my daughter's experienced it, and I know we have as a couple. And I imagine these are just two examples where people can very quickly go down that dark hole saying, I'm working my butt off to try and find a new friend group or a friend, and I can't do it. And I feel awful because I can't find somebody.
Yeah, I think that's a common thing. In fact, it's so common now, Dennis, that now there are sites for making friends. Now they have some sites dedicated to connecting people who just want to be friends. That's how big a deal it is.
Yeah.
In the UK, they actually have a council of loneliness where people are called on the phone that might be lonely. And so they have people that call these people regularly just to say hello. They tend to be elderly people, but I think we need something like that in our country too. And the
Yeah.
connection between loneliness and isolation and like even suicidality is pretty high.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
feeling like you don't have people you can turn to is really a difficult thing.
Yeah, I would say so. I want to share a couple stories with you. During COVID, I started really upping the ante on podcast listening because, what are you going to do during COVID, right? And one
Hmm.
of my favorite one was listening to the late Bob Saget, the comedian and actor, who had a wonderful podcast, and I'm a big fan of him. And for people who don't know that name, he was on America's Funniest Videos. He hosted that for
Oh,
many years, and he was also on the show Full House. So he's a tall, dark-haired guy, but he passed away over this past year, and it was very sad. And he went too early, but he hosted the most wonderful podcast, Dr. Cindy. And beside interviewing comedians and making me just laugh my butt off of having a 90-minute conversation with some of his friends, I found out down the road that he was a very caring, giving, loving guy. And if you were down on your luck or if you were lonely, he called. And he took it to the next level. And nobody had ever done this in podcasting at the time in COVID when I was listening. He would find out about listeners from his podcast and cold call them and just talk to them for 30 minutes.
wow.
It was
That's pretty
huge because
interesting.
that's the kind of guy he was. And it's a random person, right? Call, Cheryl in Chicago and talk about COVID and being lonely and isolated. It was amazing. And it kept me going during some tough times to hear that, you know what? And this goes back to what you and I have talked about a lot, being able to relate when you don't you sometimes when you have something going on here, it could be a disease, it could be loneliness, and you feel like you're the only one on the planet that's experiencing it. And when you can relate and hear that, oh, somebody else is experiencing what I am, I'm not alone. And I guess that goes back to our points talking about loneliness and isolation. You know what? You're not alone when you feel this way, everybody. It happens to everybody, whether you're with somebody, whether you're not with somebody by choice or not. It's incredible. I want to tell another story, Dr. Cindy, and on this show, I'm not afraid to share, and
Oh,
our listeners know that too. So I was living in Portland, Oregon, and having a great life with my wife and my daughter, and Zoe was in, I think, maybe the second or third grade, and we loved Portland. And my wife and I were working at the same radio group, and we probably could have stayed there the rest of our lives. But a job came up here in Washington, D.C., where I had lived as a young person, also went to school here, and it was a big leap of faith, and I took the job. And there was a lot more great reasons than there were bad reasons to take the job. So when I moved here, they gave me an allowance to have my own apartment out in Gaithersburg, and to start my job. And I had to go all the way to Silver Spring to work, so the commute was awful. Anybody can relate to that on 270.
oh yeah.
And I went home, and I realized when I moved into my place that they had taken care of me with that I really didn't have any of my stuff. And I went to like a Whole Foods and I went shopping because I realized that about 8 o'clock that night I had no groceries.
Uh-huh.
So I went shopping, and it's one of these core memories, Dr. Cindy, is that I'm pushing my cart and I look at the empty cart, and it's late at night, so there's not a lot of people there, and I felt sick to my stomach. I
Sure.
was missing my wife. I was missing my daughter, and I was
Mhm.
questioning what in the hell am I doing here by myself in this place. I felt isolated. I felt alone, and I got
Mhm.
super depressed really quickly. In fact,
Mhm.
I called my wife while I was in the grocery store and said, I'm not sure if I made the right decision. I think we've all been there, but I felt
Right.
brutal. And this was in, my late 40s when I took this gig, and it was a horrific feeling.
Yeah,
And
that's
I
very
share that
difficult.
I share that everybody because it can take something like that, a new job when you're away from your loved ones, And even though you're trying to have a better life for everybody, you make more money, you work in a bigger market, da 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 da, that you can feel isolated and alone, even though you have people in your lives. I just happened to be 3,000 miles away from them and was questioning every decision I had made over the last couple of weeks of taking that job. Now, everything worked out, and starting a new job the first couple of weeks are hell anyways, Dr. Siddi. It was brutal, but it worked itself out, and life goes on, and I took that path. But I share that story just because I remember that I hadn't felt alone and isolated in a very long time in my life, because I had my beautiful family, and then I make these decisions which I think are better for myself, and yet I felt alone and isolated and really dark. I mean, it just was not a good couple of weeks for me.
Yeah, you bring up an interesting kind of cluster of things there. You're moving to a
Mm-hmm.
completely new place where you don't know anyone,
Right.
and you're taking a new job, and you're away from your loved ones. All of those things are really hard. And then some people are moving in the same way you are, except they don't have anyone with them. So
Right.
there's that kind of a loneliness that happens with coming to a brand new area. Then there's the kind of loneliness that happens at the loss of a spouse as you're older, or younger, perhaps due to death or divorce. Those are different kinds of losses. Then there's another kind of loneliness that has to do with a chronic sense of unease in the company of others, that has to do with a lot of high level social anxiety, that some
Mm-hmm.
people are not feeling comfortable socially. And so they don't know how to reach out and foster connections and maintain connections. And so that's a whole different group of people. And some of those people are partnered, and some of those people are alone, but that's a whole nother kind of loneliness that some people struggle with.
So when you're talking to people about being depressed, isolation, feeling alone, I know everybody's different. And once again, we're talking in general terms. When you're chatting with them after you listen to them, what are you giving them to do moving forward?
Lean in, not out. Do more, take risks. Some of your risks will fail miserably. So
Mm-hmm.
what? You are going to feel uncomfortable. That's okay. Those are the kinds of things I'm saying. You know, do lots of activities. Notice which ones you like more. What are the activities when you're connecting with someone? Do you sense when there's a connection? Do you notice what helps you feel connected? Some people I refer to group therapy, where you have a
Mm-hmm.
chance to literally practice engaging with others in the safety and protection of a private space that's led by a therapist who's noticing how it's going between people and commenting on it as you go. So that's a whole nother thing. Or joining a support group is another way, or joining an activity group. So there are lots of different ways you can make connections, but you have to make connections. I think I'm always struck, Dennis, by the number of people who somehow have the fantasy that you're going to stay at home inside your place. Someone's going to knock on the door and say, "Hi, I understand you'd like a friend." I mean, that isn't
Yeah,
happening. That's
no,
not
it's not.
going on. And the
No.
people that I've known in my own life that are dear friends to this day are people that I met out doing things that I enjoy, things that I'm engaged in one way or another, whether it's a professional thing or a personal activity, that I'm somehow involved with this thing, and I come across another person who shares a certain kind of sensibility with me of one sort or another. And then there needs to be effort made by me and by the other person to reach out and try to connect. Some of those connections go well, some of them don't. And there needs to be reciprocity. You can't be the only one doing the reaching. And if you're feeling like you're the only one that is doing the reaching, time to take a look at that too.
Yeah. I've always wanted to ask you this, and I ask this of people that cut my hair, my doctor, people that specialize in something. When you aren't feeling well, and whatever it is, it doesn't have to be loneliness and isolation, but when you're not feeling well, since you are practiced in specifically this and talking to people about their feelings and their actions, what do you do when you're not feeling well?
When you say not feeling well, you mean I'm feeling lonely myself?
Yeah, if you're feeling lonely, isolated, or if you have troubles in your life, do you talk to somebody? What is it like for you? And is it
Certainly,
hard to
I
talk to?
have. certainly I have talked to people. Sometimes it could be a professional, sometimes it could be a friend or a family member. It varies. I mean, certainly any therapist needs to have had their own therapy. So you
Sure.
need to have your own story
Yeah.
together and understand your own issues. I mean, I think at this point in time, I would be turning to activities that I find reassuring. I think getting back to basics is always a good thing. Keeping your routine. I exercise every day of the week. That's
Yeah.
because, you know, when we go to sleep at night, we turn off our brain. We have REM sleep. And anybody who's ever listened to the hidden brain, it really explains this. I say that
Yes.
when we wake up in the morning, we put on our clothes and we put on our defenses. And before
Right.
you put on those defenses, you might not feel that good. And so exercise is a great way to snap out of that. That's one
En-
thing.
Endorphins. Yes.
Yes. And so also you could combine that with sharing that activity with a friend. I have a friend I walk with regularly. We meet in the park, we walk regularly. It's a
That's
nice way to
nice.
kill two birds with one
Yeah.
stone. I don't like
Yeah.
that expression much, two birds with one stone. But we get to see one another and we get some activity. And that's a shared interest that we both have. And so looking for those shared interests and opportunities, then you also want to be thinking about mixing it up sometimes, trying something new, going outside your comfort zone, being brave in those kinds of ways, I also find to be very useful. And remembering that you're alone. You're alone. If you're having issues, it's up to you to figure out what to do about them.
Yeah. And I really dig what you said earlier about lean in. And Dr. Cindy actually leaned into the camera. Well, we're on Teams right now. And when she said that, and I took that, that's really good advice. The other thing that you brought up that I really have done, and I suggested to my daughter over the years, because she needs structure and she needs to stay busy. And, I said working out, sports, whatever you want to do, but just structure your life up. If you're feeling poor about something, whether it's a friend group or maybe it's something, dating or whatever it could be that's just making you feel isolated and alone, is work out and stay busy. And you're kind of talking about that.
Yes.
If you keep your body and your brain busy, it start that isolation and the worries go away at least for a little couple of hours, and that's a good feeling.
The way I would put it to you, Dennis, is we all have waves of feeling that come over us. And if you time it, it will pass one way or another.
Yeah.
And you can also work on a little bit of intimacy with yourself, which is, how am I doing? What's causing this feeling? What do I need to do to take really good care of myself right now? Oh, I'm not feeling good. Oh, wonder what that's about. Be a little curious and caring towards yourself there. What do I need to do right now? What would feel good right now? Sometimes I call it a poorly trained self supporting function when we're feeling that way. Like
Hmm.
yourself is yelling at you to pay attention because you're not listening. And
Hmm.
yelling, of course, never goes well, whether we're doing it with ourselves or someone else. So you have to turn down the volume enough to be able to hear the message without delivering it in a mean spirited way. But people yell at themselves because we tend to ignore ourselves. So you might need to kind of get into a little bit of a quiet space so you can hear that quiet voice inside. What's that part of you saying to you?
Right.
Is it saying
Right.
to you, wow, you're really behind on your work? You need to sit and do some work because you're stressed out? Is it saying, gee, you haven't seen anybody in days? Maybe you need to make one call a day for the next 3 days? And I do like what you said about structure. If you're feeling isolated, then make it your project to do something about it.
Yes.
Connection, the phone works both ways. Don't be sitting around waiting for somebody to contact you.
Right. Right. Listen, we have to say goodbye here. We only have 30 seconds left. Would you like to give your website to all the people that are listening right now? I know that they hear you regularly on the show, but just to be reminded about what you do and who you are.
Sure. Cynthia Post, Ph.D.com.
All right. Well, Dr. Cindy, thank you so much for the chat. It's great to see you again after about a month and a half. I hope that
It's
you and your family are well.
Yes, thank you. It's great to see you too, Dennis. And I wish you well too, and look forward to talking with you soon.
All right. Football's starting, so I'm feeling a lot better.
Okay.
Thanks so much for joining us on Community DC. And we'll talk to everybody next Sunday again.